Howdy, and welcome to the second video for the first week of class. And hopefully my voice will be stronger and louder in this video. Let's get started. We spent the previous lecture talking about the enterprise and risk and in a general sense. So we're going to look more at the notion of risk. And everything is based on risk. I work primarily in cybersecurity. Security, risk. There is no way. Anyone that says any system is 100% secure, no. Well, that risk is that probability of something going wrong and suffering a loss. And we'll talk about this. So we're going to use risk to define it within how we're going to look at enterprise risk management, right? So to understand how to manage it, we understand more about what risk is. Now, you're going to learn something about me in this class, and that is I like simple definitions. Yes, I have a law degree, so, lawyers like definitions that take an entire page. I like the simple definitions. And we'll say this, defining risk. What are we protecting against? There's some, I once went to a fancy dinner and got there and looked down and realized I had two mismatched shoes on. Okay, it was embarrassing. It was funny. Everybody remembers me from that dinner since one was gray and one was beige, and, But my point is, who cares? Right? There's some things that can happen we don't really care about. We care about those material events that cause us risk. So in our every day, we make mistakes, we lose our focus, we do something that's de minimis. The consequences are de minimis. So my point in telling you this is when we talk about risk, we want to look at those things that have significant impact or consequences. Here's my Paula DeWitt definition of risk. Probability of a loss. That's your risk. Probability of a loss. What's the chance the United States will go into recession next year? Excuse me. And if you have money in your retirement, you're going to lose money in your retirement. Probability of a loss, right? What's the chance that your company will have to do a layoff? What's the chance that your company will lose product or market dominance? And so it's about loss. When we talk about risk, yes, you'll talk about the upside of risk, how in all risk there tends to be an opportunity. We talked about this in the last lecture, how certain businesses actually grew after events like 9/11. But when we talk about risk, let's think of that four-word definition. Probability of a loss. Probability, that's statistics. It's between 0 and 1. All right? We will talk about black swan events, very low probability. Well, then why do we worry about them if it's very low probability? Because a black swan event, if it occurs, again, risk and impact. The impact of that is disastrous. So I want you to think about how you define risk and if it's consistent with mine, and then be thinking some examples of risk that you face every day in your work life. And we'll do some discussions on this. Okay, so risk is present whenever there's a 100% chance an event will occur, will not occur, less than 100% chance, that the event's not going to occur as expected, which is everything, right? We live in risk. Nothing is 100% certain. The old Ben Franklin thing, except death and taxes, all right? Everything is probabilistic, right? I got up this morning, I was driving to Galveston, I was a little bit stressed because I hadn't gotten these videos done and they should have been done, and I'm kind of beating myself up, and it's raining, and I'm thinking, should I risk driving to Galveston? How bad is the rain? Is there going to be street flooding? What time do I need to be to Galveston? Can I work at home? I can't work at home because I have a roommate that's moving out, and there's going to be... So my point is, everything's probabilistic, right? I took the chance. I drove to Galveston. I'm working from my A&M office in Galveston. The weather, it's a risk. The fact that there might be construction, that's a risk. Typically, this takes me about less than an hour to get from my home in Houston to my office in Galveston. What are the things that could impact that? What is the impact? What are the consequences? So everything has risk. So in ERM, if everything operated the way it should be, we'd all have a great life in business, right? But nothing operates the way it should be. When I ran my own business, at one time had up to 90 employees, a business I started, to say the reason you plan isn't because the plan ever works as intended, but it gives you something to fall back on when things happen that you didn't plan on, right? At least you have some kind of structure. So the context VRM, risk is any deviation from what is expected. And what is expected is usually within a range. Now, the book makes a point, and I don't want to overly emphasize it, about the upside and downside volatility. So you might have a financial risk that, or there's a, the old Chinese saying about, I believe the word crisis is actually danger and opportunity. It's two figures in its language. One of the things we as business people want to do when we manage risk is also look for the opportunity. We talked about this last lecture. The opportunity for telecommunications, for certain technology, the opportunity to change how you did business following 9/11, because it made people aware of the risk. So we don't want to talk about higher probabilities of risk. However, I come from the technology area, and I always love talking to my students. Like the 80s to them is ancient history. Like, did you code on stone tablets or something? They have no kind of clue. But if I bring up some of the big computer companies that were around, Osborne, that invented the what we called portable, it really wasn't portable compared to today's laptops, more like transportable. I think they weighed like 20 pounds. And other businesses, Data General, Digital Equipment, Symbolics, all these that were groundbreaking computer companies that today no one's ever heard of. And why is that? One time these were high profitable companies. These were companies you'd think they were run by smart people. Why aren't they around? Because technology changed, and strategically they didn't focus on that because they were lulled into a false sense of confidence because of their profitability. So we're going to talk about risk, how that works in an enterprise where you have offsets from other business segments, from other events, and the volatility itself, upside and downside. We are all in business because you kind of have to like a certain amount of excitement, right? When you talk about risk, if everything worked as planned, it would kind of be dull and boring, and we could all find jobs that were a little more dull and boring than what we do. But my emphasis here is in every risk, when we look at the risk, we look at it within the totality of the enterprise. We try to assess the magnitude of that risk. Maybe it's a small probability, but the impact could be huge. Perhaps a way to mitigate that risk, again, is an opportunity for business growth. So offsets from other business segments could be an event that has some effect on another business segment. And my great student assistants put this in about Michael Phelps. When he broke a bone in his wrist, it was like, oh my God, my training, it's not going to go. But he used that to his advantage. And we see this quite a bit where there will be something that looks like it could be career ending or market ending in business or something. How do you turn that and use it to your advantage? I talked a little bit in the last lectures, we all have risk in our career. And by managing that risk, we may take a path in our career that we had never planned on before. That's the kind of idea and thinking we need to have on the enterprise risk level. This could be a disaster, or this could be bad, or this could cost us certain things, but somewhere is there an opportunity to either do something different, to handle it differently, or the like. Now, one thing about risk is when you have multiple risk events, when you have cascading events, when you have things that might not seem to be linked, but kind of are, maybe not in a causal sense, not as a cause or effect. And again, I kind of apologize, I'll use a lot of technology examples, but a lot of times this happens where two events come together, like some kind of disaster or some kind of emergency or some kind of crisis, just about the time there's something else going on. So let's say there's a oil and gas spill just about the time the price of oil is dropping. Well, they're not related to each other, but a company is being hit with multiple risk. And the price of oil is dropping, they have to deal with that. At the same time, they have a crisis situation because they're part of some kind of oil spill. Or using an example from technology, you have planning to roll out some new wonderful feature, in your social media, and about the same time, not due to anything that your company might have done, but as an effect, there's an increasing compliance look or reputation look at privacy, and suddenly you have this investment in R&D that you wanted to roll out in social media, and you've been working on it and spend all this money, and at the same time suddenly you're hit with this compliance kind of issue. It seeming not do anything you did, so there are multiple events, but they're going to affect each other in some way. So risk is normally viewed as a possibility of a loss. Yes, that's how I view it. But sometimes this is making a point from the book, results in short-sightedness, and this is what I want to say. When I talk about risk being the possibility or probability of loss, at the same time, you have to put that in perspective. There's a 100% chance that someday each of us will die, right? That's one thing that's 100% certain. Somebody, might be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, tomorrow, next week, we don't know. Okay, but we accept that risk. We can't change that risk. Right? But at the same time, we don't let that risk say, well, I'm not going to get out of bed or do anything with my life. I'm not going to go to school. I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to have kids, because there are things we want to do. So when I say the possibility, probability of loss, we don't want that to be the overwhelming controlling factor. If I say there's a high level of risk this could happen, or if I say there's an 80% chance this could happen, I've just defined risk qualitatively, just said high level of risk, and quantitatively, 80%. This shouldn't limit us in saying, okay, we want to leave that market area, or we want to do this, or we want to do that. So we want to look at risk and not consider that all risk is bad. Risk is. We have risk. Risk exists. We have to deal with it. Okay, so let's look at that within ERM. This is from the first lecture again. Identify, measure, manage, and disclose all key risks to increase value to stakeholders. If you remember, the first time I looked at this, I had stakeholders in red, because stakeholders are not just shareholders. They're not just owners of an enterprise. They're those that are affected by that. So what's our challenge? Well, first of all, we have to identify risk. That's pretty hard. That's a bit of an art still than a science, and we use the Facebook data scraping. Then we have to be able to measure that. Well, that's hard too. Okay, I've identified this risk, but I can't measure it because I've not ever seen this before. It's like a 0-day risk. It's like something I've not encountered. I don't know how to measure it. How do I measure the potential of a risk to my reputation? How do I know how that's going to affect me in the marketplace? Then we have to manage the risk. And as I said before, 4 ways you can manage: avoid, accept, mitigate, or transfer. That's it, 4 ways. We can avoid the risk and say, we're just not going to do that. We can accept the risk and say, we're going to do it and accept that something bad could happen. We can mitigate it and say, kind of like, we're going to accept it, but we're going to do some things to minimize the damage that risk could do. Or we could transfer it, or some combination of those last 2, which is insurance. So we're going to identify, measure, manage, and then we have to disclose it. And we have to know how to disclose it. We have to know how to disclose it so we are honest and truthful and ethical, and at the same time put it in perspective. I say this in my law and policy class at A&M when I'm teaching this, and I always get kind of a funny look from some of the international students, but I'll always say, we are in the United States. We are a capitalistic country. We run on business. The way we run our businesses is different than a lot of other countries, because we have a different philosophy of business. And our philosophy of business is to increase value to the shareholders, to make profit, in an ethical, moral, legal and manner, right? So how do we identify? Boy, that's hard. Measure? Yeah, that's hard. Manage? Oh boy. And then disclose it to increase value to the shareholders. That's our challenge. So we've identified 10 key criteria for risk, and we'll go through each of these. And we'll talk about, and these are again just out of the book, kind of, this is like the classical risk management style, or excuse me, enterprise risk management. So this area is a business, and we've seen this happen. Someone gets so married to some level of business. Take a minute and look at the watch if you're actually wearing a watch. How do you tell time? Do you have a watch? If you're a millennial, my kids don't wear watches because they use the phone to tell time. They only wear watches when they go to the gym, so it can, give them other information that we don't traditionally think of as being from a watch. When I was a kid, if somebody had said you can get your heart rate and all this stuff from your watch, it'd be like, what? This is a battery operated watch, or this is a wind up watch, right? Well, at one time, almost all the quality watches in the world were made in Switzerland. And that changed very rapidly in probably the 70s and 80s because they assumed, the Swiss watch manufacturers, that everyone would want Swiss watches. They were excellent mechanical devices. They were very precise. They told the time. Hello, what else could you want from a watch? Well, along came the Japanese who created a whole new market in cheap electronic watches. And suddenly you could even have a watch with a calculator on it. Man, how cool was that? Then look at so the Swiss didn't see that coming. So this was a golden boy. They were so sure that what they had done for the previous couple hundred of years was going to carry them in the future that they didn't look at the market potential. Okay. The second example here is AIG. If there's a lot to be learned from two key disasters in this century, one is Enron, and then the other is the 2008, which put Lehman Brothers, which was like a 150-year-old business, fascinating business, completely out of business. And the only reason AIG was left in business is because it had to be bailed out or it was going to wreck the global economy, right? It was allowed to operate because everything seemed fine. We're making money. What could be wrong? Oh my gosh, we didn't accurately identify. Let's go back to our words. We didn't accurately identify, measure, manage, and disclose the risk. And as a result, Lehman Brothers, lost the company. AIG could have collapsed if it had not been for having the global economy realize how disastrous this impact would be and bailing them out. Now, this talks about enterprise-wide scope. We tend to think, we get blindsided, and this is just, this is human nature. We have our blinders on. We fall in love with a certain aspect of business. I remember when Jack Welch was CEO of GE, and they were going to sell off certain components of the business, and oh my God, how could you do this? This company had been started by Thomas Edison and the like, but he realized these weren't profitable. They were not long-term profitable. They were becoming so commoditized. So one of the things he sold off, I think, was their appliance division. Well, this is what happens too. We look at things that are insignificant. Black swan is something that has a very low probability, but the consequences can be disastrous. The best example I can think of is a tsunami that hit 10 or 12 years ago or so that killed over 100,000 people. The probability of that event happening, that tsunami happening, was so small that it wasn't even considered. But when it did happen, disastrous consequences. There was no way to mitigate the risk during the actual tsunami. I don't know how many of you would remember this event, but there were people who were taking pictures. They would find cameras where people were taking pictures as this huge wall of water was moving up on the islands because they didn't consider that when that water hit, it was like the force of being dropped, on concrete at 70 miles an hour, right? That it was going to snap their limbs. So it's a black swan event, very low probability, but disastrous consequences. Okay? So when we talk about this enterprise, again, one area that's fascinating and yet complex is the notion that we have all these sectors of business feeding off each other. When Jack Welch, CEO of GE, dropped this, a lot of people said, oh my God, your reputation's never going to recover. He concentrated on three key areas, if memory serves me correctly. The capital, basically they were financing the light bulbs and jet engines, right? Jet engines, because they still make jet engines. These were the money makers. You could make money lending money. Apparently light bulbs, if they still own that business, but the jet engines, they were one of few manufacturers in the United States that made jet engines, both for aircraft and fixable assets like in power plants and stuff. Okay, so how the specific sectors affect each other. And the big thing is and that I hone into a lot is reputation, because reputation to me is such an awesomely difficult risk. We don't know how it's going to affect our reputation, but the second component of that is if we have a business with several sectors, that reputation, it doesn't matter if it was one bad behaving sector, it gets attached to the brand name. Then we have different cultures. And we don't just talk about cultures of different people coming from different countries. We talk about different cultures within a business. If you run a large business and they do, for instance, work with the government and commercial work, almost always, 100% of the time, they will separate that into separate business units because of compliance issues, certain compliance and accounting issues, but also because the culture of producing work for the government is so different than producing work for commercial markets. Or sometimes you will have different culture of people who are developing products for consumers versus a B2B transaction, business to business. So when we talk about an ERM program, early on, as I said in one of the first lectures, the ERM that I used to see in conferences in like the 90s, your business model had to fit into that. Well, in reality, our business model, the ERM needs to fit into our business model. How do we do business? And then how do these separate sectors affect everything within the large enterprise? This is an important slide because this is the essence of how we're going to talk about risk. It's going to be financial, it's going to be strategic, it's going to be operational. That's going to be the big three, and what we're going to spend the rest of the semester doing is figuring out how the risk components affect those. Strategic means how you are planning to run your business in the long term. Financial means money. Do you have the money to do it? Cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. Do prices come about? Do interest rates dramatically change? I had a rental property when President Carter was in the office, and interest rates hit post-Civil War highs. We literally had a rental property we could not get a loan on, and basically we MasterCarded it. We were paying 18% interest. We basically had to carry it for a year just paying the interest because the interest rates had gone so high. What happened? The effect of high interest rates. The housing markets fell. The prices of homes fell because there weren't buyers for them, and precipitated some bad economic times. So when we talk about financial risk, everything that can affect us, it has a dollar sign. Prices. We have a new competitor. My gosh, that competitor, his manufacturing is offshore. Great. His labor costs are $2 a day while I'm paying union wages or something like this. He's going to drive me up for lower prices. Do I have the cash on hand? Am I liquid enough to meet demands? The third risk is operational, and that's just changes in elements related to operations, how we do things, how we actually do the nuts and bolts, putting the hands and getting the work done. So those are the big three: financial, strategic, operational. And the risk that we are going to develop, the mapping we're going to try, and then when I say try, I don't mean we're going to try and fail. I mean try because this is this is a difficult problem. How do all these areas of risk, these categories of risk, affect this? So let's take my area, cybersecurity. Let's say my strategy didn't include having a strong cyber policy. I just put that under my IT, and I thought, well, can't IT handle that? It's all about computers, right? And I have a significant breach. Well, my strategy failed. I can't do my business operations, and I'm going to have a financial impact. So cyber risk ends up affecting all three of these. But along the way, you have other things, compliance. Maybe that cyber risk caused a problem with the regulators, or compliance, or legal risk. I got sued by my shareholders, or reputation risk. I was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, my company. Well, how does all these feed into these three areas? But also, how does that reputation, legal, compliance, and cyber risk feed into each other? That's going to be our challenge. And that's what I mean by this slide. So we talk about the ERM programs almost solely focused on one of these, but what you But what I don't see, and I've looked for this, so if I'm wrong, please send me some information, is I don't see a lot of work being done in what I'm trying to do in this class. Talk about the interdependence of the risk elements that feed into these three. That's going to end it for this lecture because I figure you need a break. And I will be back with lecture 2, video